I will, of course, say to colleagues who perhaps are too young to remember the great days of the 1990s, but as Andrew's here, I can safely say it. I spent 5 years in the Department of Transport, having been promoted to the level of my own incompetence. That's what they do in government, you know. However, I have to say I loved it. I've had a lifelong fascination with not just, transport in the train spotting sense, but more in the sense that so much of modern life is about, for example, urbanization. So much of it is about connectivity, about getting the people without jobs to the jobs without people. And, nowhere more so than in a country like this, where I think the biggest single socio-economic challenge the country has got is rebalancing Britain, actually. You live here in what's effectively a fortress. It's a fortress you don't leave. The day you sell your two-bedroom flat in Hackney to go and buy a 5-bedroom detached house and garden in Middlesbrough is the day you'll never be able to buy your two-bedroom flat back. And if you're thinking of leaving your nice 5-bedroom detached house in Middlesbrough to come and take a job in the city, well, just remember that what you're going to get is a two-bedroom flat in Hackney if you're quick enough and early enough up in the morning. It's pretty damning when actually the average price of a home in London has just exceeded £500,000, just gone over the £500,000 mark, and yet in parts of the north of England, both northwest and northeast, you can buy a home for under £100,000, well under in many places. Now, this kind of sense of rebalancing Britain is what gave George Osborne, if you like, the intellectual fuel behind the Northern Powerhouse. It's a vital part of saying, why do we just have this one concentrated area in the UK in which all the serious economic activity happens? Fascinating that 20% of the entire country's GDP is generated just in the 33 boroughs. Now, that's not something to boast about. That's actually something to worry about, because that degree of concentration is actually unhealthy for the reasons that I've just outlined. That's where transportation, to me, matters so much. That's why I've been such a strong supporter of projects like HS2 and others, and indeed of the whole idea of the Northern Powerhouse. So when I talk about challenges and uncertainties, which was Sue's introduction, I think we should start actually by noting at least one development that's actually very positive. And the development that's very, very positive has been, in my view, since the election of the coalition government, a recognition in the Treasury that actually infrastructure matters. That's easy to say, but it's actually a hugely profound change. I'm not going to get into all our yesterdays, but for what it's worth, in the years when I was in that department, and I was prior to that in the Home Office, and prior to that in DTI, and then prior to that in the old Department of Environment, so saw a number of departments of government, your capital was allocated on an annual basis. It could fluctuate wildly. In London, it varied in my time by literally hundreds of millions, from feast to the very following year, absolute famine, effectively no capital programme. And of course, what that produces, and always has done in this country, is two things. One is a ludicrous reliance on our Victorian forebears. We're still relying to this day in this city on Mr. Bazalgette's sewerage system, and it'll be several years yet before you can safely flush and run. We rely to far too great an extent on a Victorian rail system, not least, of course, our underground system, parts of which are, as you will all know, well over 150 years old. What we didn't do at all in those days was have a serious plan for developing our transport network, and it showed. We were at best patching and mending, and when we did have large amounts of money and decided to start spending it, the programme would be disrupted by our inability to be able to continue to spend at a seriously coherent level. Now, that has changed, and I think we should welcome that. I know Jim O'Sullivan was here talking about the 5-year roads investment strategy. Great stuff, 11 billion of capital investment, 1.2 billion of efficiency savings, 5 billion spent on upgrading worn-out highway and so on. This is terrific stuff. But it's an absolute sea change away from where we were before the new regime, if you like, from 2010 onwards actually arrived. Not just roads, we've seen CP5 and its predecessors. This is, again, an enormously welcome development. I'm not going to dwell on the efficiency with which CP4 and CP5 have been rolled out. That's a matter where we've clearly got a long way to go to get to optimal performance. But the reality is that the certainty of funding, the idea that you can actually plan a program, that you can prioritize, that you can start choosing the schemes that deliver the best value and then get them underway and know that you can see them to a finish, sounds so obvious. In many countries in Europe, in many countries in the developed world, the very idea of having this conversation would be absurd, it would be laughable. Of course that's what you do. But in the UK, this is a real significant development, and I think we should welcome it wholeheartedly. What, of course, we now need to see is that with this certainty of funding, we start to address all the other issues that relate to our ability to roll out a coherent strategy. The start to that is Andrew Adonis's chairing of the National Infrastructure Commission. It's, in my view, again, a terrific development. It's long, long overdue. And here I simply enter the usual and, in my view, inevitable caveat, which is let's see the money follow the fine words. And that, incidentally, is something that I think, anybody in a spending department knows. The great thing is he can't say it, but I can. He's still banged up, and I'm out on license. It's terrific. I mean, but don't worry, mate, it'll be over before you know it. No, I mean, not that I'm speaking from personal experience at all. But as I say, I mean, I think, we should be very clear that this is a big step forward. We're in a much better position. When you talk about uncertainty, let's be clear that to remove some of the uncertainties around funding, which were quite fundamental, is itself a massive step forward. So we can now concentrate, in a sense, on the other uncertainties that there are in our world. One of them, I have to say, concerns me is around local transport authority funding. There's a sense in which in governments of both complexions over the last 20-odd years, in my personal experience, governments have laid more and more responsibility on local authorities and given them less and less money to discharge it. Sometimes that results in local authorities doing things which appear to be rather counterintuitive, indeed sometimes described as silly or bad value. This may very well be the case. But when you're faced with the kind of choices that local authorities have to make, many people in this room will, I know, have served on a local authority. I know I did for many years. You realize that this is a choice between a rock and a hard place. Neither of these alternatives is going to be attractive, but you have to pick one or the other. And just in that context, and now that we're talking about subnational bodies, they, of course, make enormous sense. The idea that lay behind the Greater London Authority and the success of London under the Mayor and the GLA was precisely that transportation has to be seen on at least a sub-regional basis, certainly on a city-region-wide basis, call it subnational, whatever you like to call it. The idea of saying these ought to be connected plans is clearly an extremely good one. But I was at an Independent Transport Commission seminar not so long ago, which was looking at what devolution, which is what all the subnational bodies, of course, are all about, actually meant for transport. Well, it allows a much more coherent planning process, as we say. It allows you to integrate things like bus operations with bus lanes and all of the idiotic nonsenses which currently bedevil some of our integrated transport network. But one of the people present was my old permanent secretary, Sir Patrick Brown. And he made, I think, a very telling point. He said, be careful what you wish for. He said, be careful what you wish for, because your subnational body, your city region-wide body, is going to develop a plan, and it's going to sell that plan to its local electorate, and it'll be responsible for that plan. But the man in the Treasury still controls the purse strings. And actually, the challenge in an uncertain world is to remove the uncertainty that will otherwise undermine the success of these subnational bodies. The truth is that what has also been a challenge for governments of both persuasions for as long as I can remember is how we convert from the current system by which the average local authority gets 83% of its funding from government and only raises 17% itself locally. When I last told an audience like this of that statistic in Birmingham, the then leader of Birmingham City Council, Albert Bohr, said to me, in this city, believe it or not, Steve, it's 13%. That's all I get. Everything else comes in packets from government departments saying, please do this with this money, please do that with that money. Often, incidentally, those things are colliding in the middle. It is a very, very poor way to manage value. But as long as the person in the Treasury is controlling the purse strings, be careful what you wish for in terms of the success of these subnational bodies. To me, that's a real challenge for the industry. It's one we've got to face. It's a challenge genuinely for politicians. This is not a party issue. It's as I say, it's an issue for government. We have to find a better way to fund local services and, frankly, to do so by raising the money locally so that there's a genuine sense of accountability, but there's also a sense that once you buy into these programs can be continued because they have popular democratic support. As far as the other, if you like, the other great challenges are concerned in an uncertain world, those that I've come across personally, having been involved in civil engineering contracting and in civil engineering advisory work and in transport technology, the biggest, without a shadow of a doubt, is the skills gap. Now, I know you'll have heard something of this from previous speakers, but you simply can't have a conference like this without understanding the significance of that skills gap. Actually, why do we have a skills gap when the kind of skills we're talking about are actually exportable? You know, the kind of people we're talking about who are qualified in any of the engineering disciplines, any of the technology disciplines, any of the planning disciplines, can take that across the world. Because this country, with the density of its transport network, has a great reputation for innovation and for quality. So why wouldn't you get young people going into these disciplines, bothering to study and to qualify? Well, not least because what you could not do in the past was ever to look at a long-term future. You were looking at stop-start investment. You were looking at, for example, in the rolling stock industry, whole years when absolutely no rolling stock orders emerged at all. You saw capital programs being sliced. You saw underspend. CP4 was underspent by $1 billion. CP5 is currently underspent. Now, what we've got to do is to marry the attractiveness of the industry, and many of these industries are attractive, as I say, because they're skilled, they can be well paid, and they are exportable around the world, to a certainty of funding, so that when, for example, a young person who has an engineering bent, who has an interest in any of these disciplines, looks at the prospect of becoming, for example, a rail engineer, whether it's in signalling, whether it's in moving block, or whether it's in any other aspect of modern rail management, that they can see a program forward which will employ them, not just this year, but in 5 years' time, and in 10 years' time, and in 15 years' time. We've not been able to do that in the past. I think we're there now. We're certainly getting to the point where that really becomes a practical possibility. Of course, we need to add that to tertiary education in these disciplines. The HS2 university, effectively headquartered in Birmingham and Doncaster, I'm sure you'll have been discussing today. If not, it's certainly worth a look. It's a terrific initiative, which I personally think is marvellous to see, and I know it'll produce some great results. But that said, it's not enough. We don't want to simply have that learning concentrated in one or two places. The next discipline is how we are able to spread the coursework that's developed there around the country, so that if your son happens to be living in Portsmouth and wants to get into rail engineering, they can access just as well as somebody who's living in Portishead. And that's a real challenge for us. Get the skill base right, and then we can address what is a huge issue at the moment, which affects viability, pricing, and delivery, which is the sheer ability of the supply chain to be able to satisfy these new national big targets. What's extraordinary is that you certainly see this in rail, less so, but certainly to a significant degree in road engineering, is how if you like, the major players in the industry have changed over the last decade. Previously, all UK civil engineering businesses. Now, I would say 6 out of 10 of the major players are actually coming in from Europe, and indeed, perhaps in the future, from even further afield, from the Far East. Why? Because we don't have a supply chain which is sufficiently robust to be able to fulfill the demands that we can now place on ourselves in terms of our infrastructure program. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, because I know you're really here, I'm just a warm-up for Andrew, is about technology. I'm personally involved in technology because I sit on the board of the Cubic Corporation. We do automated fare collection around the world. In London, of course, the Oyster card, although, be clear, Oyster is really just a piece of plastic. These days, you pay however you like. You pay with a hologram on your mobile phone, you pay with Apple Pay, you pay with your credit card, you pay with anything that's got that kind of AFC connectivity. The other day, I saw somebody pay with their watch. Terrific, just did that. Shame he had a cup of Costa coffee in his hand at the time. But you know what? That's the future, and it's absolutely great to see. I think we've got to be careful about technology. People talked about the driverless car, about connected vehicles and so on, as if they were tomorrow. I suspect that the reality is that they will be many, many years away. We will need to plan carefully, not least for the integration of the driverless vehicle into the mainstream, and we'll need to plan for the point at which actually the mainstream is driverless and the remainder of the world's population needs to be able to integrate into that road space. And here's a hint. We're not going to be building any more road space, so we're going to have to accommodate huge increases in population with diminished resources. You know, the latest projection says that in London, which when I first stood for mayor was 7.6 million, is now 8.6 million, is going to be about 10 million by 2025. The other day, I was talking to an audience which included a speaker who got the latest data on London, who says that actually by 2050, this could be home to 15 million people. That's basically 2 Birminghams and an Edinburgh. Just added. And we're not making more land, and we won't be making more roads. Those challenges technology will have to deal with. Those challenges I think we're yet to even understand. But what is quite clear is that they're also exciting challenges. And one thing I have learned over 30 years of association with the transport world is we've got some great people in this industry. A number of friends of mine who I see here today who've been in the industry for a very long time and given great service to it. I'm sure we're up to the challenge. I think the great advantage of a more precise and a more regulated funding regime, together with the one quality that the British have always been world famous for, which is ingenuity, enterprise, inventiveness, put all that together, I think the future's pretty rosy. Thank you very much.